Chapter 1, Uninvited Edition. Jake Bennett was 32 when a Korean anti-personnel mine transformed his world into endless darkness and sent him back to civilian life sooner than he had planned. His wife Sophie, a 30-year-old English teacher for foreigners, was gradually transforming from a loving spouse into an irritated caretaker with a mandatory program of sighs and eye-rolling, which, however, Jake couldn't see. 7 painful months after her husband's injury, she started an affair with Min Ho, a Korean student, a handsome man with a mind-blowing smile and gentle manners. She virtuously concealed this relationship from her sightless husband until their fragile world trembled with the arrival of Grandpa Howard, a 71-year-old Korean War veteran who was brought straight from a nursing home. No one except Howe himself, as his fellow soldiers called him, suspected that his senile dementia was nothing but a military trick perfected on the snowy hills of Incheon. The August evening was fading behind the windows, flooding the living room with that special golden light that had long ceased to exist for Jake Bennett. He sat in his armchair, acquired before that very day, and absently stroked the worn armrest, as if trying to remember what color it was. The chair preserved the memory of another Jake, the one who returned from missions with a sunburnt neck and devils in his eyes, the one who could admire Portland's hillside sunsets for hours. Now his fingers, accustomed to weapons and survival, were simply seeking an anchor point in a world that had turned into an endless night with no right to dawn. Sophie stood by the window, arms crossed over her chest, watching as the social worker, Miss Collins, who resembled an agitated heron in human form, helped the elderly man get out of the government vehicle. Great, another dependent, flashed through her mind. Her every movement betrayed that special fatigue that has nothing to do with physical exhaustion. It was a fatigue of the soul that accumulates like radiation, imperceptibly but inexorably, until it becomes deadly. For 7 months she had been her husband's eyes, his navigator, his crutch. For 7 months she had put her life on pause, and now this second one. He's simply unbearable. Miss Collins' voice sounded as if she were apologizing for a kitten's bad behavior after it stole a sock. The last straw was last week's incident. Mr. Bennett set up a full-fledged obstacle course in the West Wing. Shoelaces, tin cans with coins, some tripwires. Mrs. Henderson, our oldest resident, she's 93, broke her wrist after tripping over a fishing line stretched between a ficus tree and a chair. Howard, sitting in a wheelchair with the air of a general forced to ride a toy train, suddenly jerked his head up. His faded blue eyes seemed to see through the walls of the house, like the latest model X-ray. "Reds," he suddenly shouted with such force that Miss Collins nearly dropped her folder. "They're in the walls. Can you hear them scratching, like rats in the rice fields of Pyongyang?" Sophie flinched as if shocked. Good Lord asterisk, she thought, now there will be 2 cripples in the house. One blind, the other completely insane. "Grandpa served in Korea," Jake quietly explained, unerringly turning his head toward the shout like a radar. "He was a ghost scout. These are special units that—" "I know what ghosts are," Sophie cut him off more sharply than she intended. "Watched a documentary on Netflix. They operated behind enemy lines, gathered information, carried out sabotage. Half of them never returned." Howard, who seemed to be floating in his own reality, began humming, "Have you ever seen the rain?" His fingers, gnarled like the roots of an ancient tree, or skillfully pretending to be so, tapped the rhythm on the wheelchair armrest with the precision of a metronome. Miss Collins extracted from her briefcase a stack of papers as thick as an unpublished volume of War and Peace. "You need to sign the guardianship documents, and here's a list of his medications, sedatives, blood pressure pills, sleeping aids, vitamins." She hesitated, like a child who had forgotten a line at a morning performance. "Although he hardly takes them. Says that in the trenches you can't trust the enemy, even if the enemy is your own liver." While Sophie was signing the documents, Jake listened to his grandfather's singing. Something had changed in that elderly voice, something elusive, like a change in the wind before a storm. as if the old man wasn't singing for himself but for some invisible audience. During those rare moments when Howard had visited them before the injury, he never sang, and he certainly didn't appear insane. Howard's battered army backpack was placed in the corner of the living room like a strange altar to a bygone era. From its numerous pockets and compartments protruded some ropes, a tarnished compass, and the corner of a yellowed photograph that looked as if it remembered the times when dinosaurs were just considering extinction. Sophie stared at this backpack as if it were a ticking suitcase at an airport. In a sense, it was. "Welcome to my last mission," thought Howard, examining the house through squinted eyelids with the attentiveness of a cartographer. Only this time the enemy isn't hiding in snowy trenches. He will come on his own, confident in his invulnerability. Overconfidence is the first step toward defeat, and the second, and the third, actually. When Miss Collins finally departed, casting a last glance at Howard full of undisguised relief, as if she had gotten rid of a hand grenade with its pin pulled, a silence fell over the house, as thick as soup in a field kitchen. Sophie mechanically headed for the kitchen. Cooking dinner was the simplest way to avoid an awkward conversation with the newly arrived relative. The sound of the microwave broke the silence, and Howard reacted with a quickness one wouldn't expect from a person whose age had long since passed the mark of time to start conversations about the weather and pills. "Air raid!" His cry was filled with such genuine terror that even Sophie momentarily believed in the reality of the danger, instinctively ducking. "Jake, get down! They're bombing the perimeter! MiGs with red stars!" The old man catapulted out of his wheelchair in one fluid motion, too nimble for a man of his build and presumed frailty. His hand darted towards his grandson faster than a frog's tongue to a fly, and in an instant they were both under the massive dining table, purchased in times when dining tables were made of real wood, not sawdust held together by hope and cheap glue. "Grandpa, what are you?" Jake began, but Howard pressed a finger to his lips with a force suggesting the finger possibly had combat experience. "SHHH," he hissed with such intensity that snakes within a mile radius probably felt unprofessional. "The second pass is coming now. They always make two passes, like my ex-father-in-law at dinner." And then something happened that in some religions would be considered a miracle. Jake Bennett, a man who hadn't smiled since that day in Korea when the world literally darkened, suddenly began to laugh. It wasn't a nervous chuckle or a sarcastic snort. It was that sincere laughter that is born somewhere deep in the soul and breaks through like a spring shoot through asphalt, washing away bitterness and pain with its irrepressible force. Sophie froze in the kitchen doorway, suspended between the desire to cry and laugh, like a computer hanging between reboot and complete crash. Over the past months, she had almost forgotten how her husband's laughter sounded. And now, this demented old man. In the evening, when everyone had retreated to their rooms, Howard locked his bedroom door with a key, a latch, and an improvised barricade of a chair. Precaution, he told himself, is a soldier's best friend, right after a flask with something stronger than 40 proof. Then methodically, with military pedantry that would be the envy of the most meticulous accountant, he began laying out the contents of his backpack. His movements were no longer those of a crazy old man. Each gesture was polished and confident, like a surgeon performing the 100th operation following the same protocol. A stack of worn photographs. His unit of ghosts, wife Eleanor, may she rest in peace, though she was probably commanding some wing in heaven, little Jake in his father's arms, with a smile that shone brighter than the stars over Korea. An army compass that had saved his life 3 times in the snowy hills of Incheon. A coil of sturdy climbing rope, not that laundry nonsense sold in supermarkets, but real rope, capable of supporting the weight of a grown man, or even 2, if the second is light enough. And most importantly, a tattered notebook with records of traps and tactics of North Korean saboteurs. "Sorry, Ellie," he whispered, looking at his wife's photograph, whose face radiated that special beauty that doesn't fade with years but only becomes deeper. But our boy seems to be in trouble, and the old tricks, they still work, like your apple pie and my left knee before rain. Howard approached the window. The full moon bathed the backyard in silvery light, transforming the unkempt lawn into a miniature sea, the perfect place for what he had in mind. The old soldier smiled, the same smile that North Korean saboteurs saw last before realizing they had fallen into his trap, a smile after which some opponents preferred to surrender rather than find out what would follow. Next to the window stood an old-fashioned toaster that Howard had brought with him and with inexplicable persistence refused to leave at the nursing home. "See this yard, Comrade Toaster," he whispered, stroking the appliance's chrome side. "Soon it will become the field of our last battle, you and me, like in the good old days. Only this time we won't have to eat frozen rations." Chapter 2: English Lessons. When Min-ho first crossed the threshold of the Bennetts' home, Howard was just completing his daily perimeter inspection, a fascinating activity consisting of crawling on all fours along the living room walls with a plate-sized magnifying glass in hand. According to the old man's tactical calculations, the enemy could infiltrate the house through any, even the most microscopic crack. And the fact that the neighbor's cat regularly marked the corner of the house only confirmed his theory of interspecies conspiracy. "That cat is definitely a North Korean spy," Howard solemnly announced at breakfast, waving a piece of toast like a conductor's baton. "I've figured him out. Everyone thinks he's just marking territory, but he's actually transmitting encoded messages to the enemy. Yesterday I deciphered one. It said, 'Send more cat food and the deployment plan for nuclear missiles in Oregon.'" Their romance began 2 months ago at the Maple Leaf Cafe, where Sophie conducted English lessons for foreigners. Min-ho was 4 years younger than her, and this age difference acted on them like an aphrodisiac mixed with forbidden fruit. At first, there were innocent touches during classes, then supposedly accidental meetings after lessons, and soon passionate rendezvous at the Quiet Harbor Motel on the outskirts of town, where silence was interrupted only by their muffled moans. But soon regular meetings weren't enough. It was Sophie who suggested what seemed the height of recklessness, to conduct lessons right at her home. The very thought that they would indulge in passion a couple of rooms away from her blind husband filled them with perverse delight, like teenagers smoking behind the school. "Oh, do we have guests?" Howard raised his head from the floor when Sophie opened the front door. "Just a minute, I'm just finishing my secret report to the Pentagon. The saboteur cat sneezed 3 times toward the east this morning and wagged his tail twice. That's a clear signal to start the underwater operation." He sat in front of his faithful toaster, using it as a transmitter. "Alpha Gamma calling base. I repeat, the spy cat has activated. Reinforcements and 5 cans of tuna needed for the counterintelligence operation. Over. And a bit more butter. This toast is as dry as a politician's speech during elections." Min-ho froze in the doorway, not knowing whether to laugh or panic and flee while he could. Sophie, with a casual gesture adjusting her hair, the very gesture that had already become a signal of their secret code for Min-ho, introduced. "This is Min-ho, my student from the language exchange program. We'll be studying here at home. Min-ho, this is my husband's grandfather." Sergeant Howard Bennett, 2nd Reconnaissance Battalion of Ghosts. The old man jumped to attention as if his spine had suddenly turned into a metal rod. 3 years in Incheon, 21 confirmed. Oh my God, helicopter. He fell to the floor and began shooting at the ceiling fan with a pencil. "Everybody down. It's North Korean on an Mi-8. Jake, hearing the commotion resembling a mini-apocalypse, came out of his room, navigating by the walls with the confidence of a man who had studied every inch of his territory. "Grandpa, are you fighting with the fan again?" "It's not a fan, my boy. It's a secret North Korean development, an invisible helicopter disguised as a household appliance. I caught him when I noticed it rotates counterclockwise, a typical communist left rotation technique. Comrade Toaster agrees with me. Min-ho will be coming 3 times a week, said Sophie, trying to hide her smile like hiding candy from a child. We decided that studying at home would be more effective. And I know why, Howard suddenly declared with the air of a detective who had solved the case of the century. Because at home, there's a secret weapon against Korean spies, my signature toast with jam. Even General Kim Il-sung ran away from it without looking back. True, he later had indigestion, but that's a completely different story. By the way, did you know that indigestion in Korean sounds almost like five-year plan? Coincidence? I think not. Min-ho and Sophie exchanged glances, which expressed relief. The old man was so out of his mind that they had nothing to fear. It was like making love with a witness who considers himself invisible. Nice to meet you. Jake extended his hand toward the voice of the new guest. Min-ho shook it, trying not to look at the former Special Forces soldier's dark glasses, which reflected his own guilty face. We'll be studying in the living room, Sophie announced in a tone that brooked no objection. Grandpa, perhaps you'd like to go to your room. Of course, of course. Howard nodded happily, like a bobblehead on a taxi's dashboard. I'll just check first if the enemy has mined my favorite chair. Yesterday it felt suspiciously soft. Either the springs have sagged, or there's a gang of North Korean soldiers the size of ants hiding in it. Settled in his armchair, the old man began his regular performance, snoring with a whistle, occasionally interrupted by exclamations like, "No, Captain, that lizard isn't edible even in field conditions." Or, "Who hid a map of Seoul and a pack of chewing gum in my boots?" Sophie and Min-ho sat at the table almost flush against each other, as if the forces of gravity had suddenly changed at that precise point in space. Their fingers, accidentally, intertwined when they reached for the textbook, creating their own universe of touches under the table. "I want you," Min-ho pronounced, looking straight into her eyes with an intensity worthy of a romantic movie scene. "Almost right," Sophie whispered, leaning closer, but softer, more sensually. "Ambush," Howard suddenly yelled, jumping up in his chair as if a pin, surreptitiously embedded in the soft fabric of the seat, had finally reached its target. "Enemy at 2 o'clock. No, at 3 o'clock. Ah, damn it, don't tell me the North Koreans have changed all the clocks to daylight saving time again." He pulled a banana from his robe pocket and began speaking into it like a walkie-talkie with such seriousness that even the fruit seemed to appreciate the gravity of the moment. "All posts. We have a yellow code. I repeat, yellow code. And by the way, quite nutritious, contains potassium and other useful elements of the periodic table, about which I know no more than the spy cat knows about quantum physics." In the evening, after overhearing Sophie's phone conversation with Min-ho, a conversation she didn't even try to hide, speaking so loudly that she could be heard even in the neighboring block, Howard returned to his room and extracted from his backpack a coil of rope resembling a sleeping anaconda. "Sorry, darling," he whispered, looking at his wife's photograph, "but it seems like a real guerrilla war is about to start in this house. And this time my main ally is not air support but good old senility. Oh, senility, my faithful friend. When it's real, they fear it. When it's feigned, they underestimate it. And that's the enemy's most dangerous mistake." He unfolded a map of the house marked with red crosses, like a military operation plan. In the corner was the inscription, "Operation Toast and Justice." Code name suggested by Comrade Toaster. He's our chief strategist after General Pillow. After all, as his old sergeant used to say, if you want to catch a fox, think like a fox. And in matters of camouflage and traps, Howard had no equal since Incheon, especially when he had on his side the faithful Toaster radio operator and the double agent Cat, who possibly didn't even suspect his important mission in this covert operation. Chapter 3: Security Systems. "Attention, all posts. Howard's voice rang through the house like an archangel's trumpet announcing the beginning, if not of the apocalypse, then at least of a very noisy day. "We're beginning Operation Ringing Perimeter." The code name was coined by Private Toaster. He's our chief of marketing and public relations. His previous idea, Hot Toast's Hot News, was rejected by the War Council represented by General Pillow. It was 7 in the morning, a time when most people are still hugging their pillows rather than commanding imaginary armies. But Howard was already in full parade mode. This time his troops consisted of a collection of bells purchased at a pet store, to the great surprise of the saleswoman, who, however, had seen even odder characters. A spool of fishing line thinner than a hair but stronger than some politician's promises, and an impressive collection of tin cans, which he had been begging from neighbors for 3 weeks. For creating a resistance symphony orchestra, he explained to them, winking so conspiratorially that some neighbors started checking if anything had gone missing from their homes. "Grandpa, what are you doing?" Jake, awakened by the cacophony of sounds, came downstairs, habitually holding onto the wall like a sailor clutching the railings during a storm. "Setting up a defensive perimeter, my boy." Howard was just securing the first bell above the kitchen door with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. "You see, in Korea we use such a system. Oh, sorry, of course you can't see, but soon you'll hear. Each bell will have its own special ring. This one, for example, I've named Morning Breeze with a note of betrayal. And the one that will be at the back door, Midnight Serenade for Comrade Kim Il sung with elements of jazz." Jake couldn't suppress a smile that spread across his face like butter on hot toast. "And why do we need this musical security system?" "Because yesterday the cat transmitted a code to the pigeons. I saw him meowing to them in Morse code. 3 shorts, 2 longs. Do you know what that means in cat language? Target identified, awaiting instructions, and an extra portion of cat food, preferably with tuna." Howard continued to rattle on like an old engine, but his eyes, sharp as a sniper's, carefully watched as Jake cautiously moved down the corridor, listening to the bells ringing. With each step, his grandson's movements became more confident. He was beginning to create a sound map of the house in his head, like a bat orienting itself using echolocation. By noon, the security system was fully installed, like a miniature Maginot line crossing the house. Bells hung on every door. Tripwires with jingling bells traversed the corridors like a musical spider web, and in the yard, tin cans were strategically placed, lightly covered with soil. The first line of defense against unwelcome guests and overly curious neighbors. "Comrade Cat," Howard shouted into the garden through the open window with the enthusiasm of a street preacher. "Try getting through my perimeter now. No cat reconnaissance will pass unnoticed. Unless you've learned to fly, but for that you'd need a secret weapon called Red Bull, and as far as I know, it hasn't yet been supplied to the feline forces." The neighbors had already grown accustomed to the crazy veteran's antics and just shook their heads like bobbleheads. Mrs. Thompson from across the street had even begun keeping a journal of his most bizarre statements. "Today old Howard accused my geranium of espionage for North Korea," she wrote that day in her neat handwriting of a former teacher. "Said that red flowers are a clear sign of communist propaganda, and demanded that I prove its innocence by producing the plant's passport." That same evening, Minho came for another lesson. Sophie greeted him at the door looking as if she hadn't seen him for an eternity, not 24 hours, and they exchanged glances that could melt the polar ice caps without any global warming. "Intruder in the perimeter," Howard shouted from his observation post in the armchair, jumping so high that he nearly met the ceiling. "The spy cat has brought REINFORCMENTS, possibly a North Korean landing force disguised as a language course student." "It's just Min-ho, Grandpa," Sophie sighed with the patience of a person explaining for the 5th time that day why the sky is blue. "Remember, my student." "Ah, yes, yes." Howard pretended to calm down but continued muttering to himself like a spell. Of course, student. Right, I remember. In 51, we also had a student. Then it turned out he learned more of our military secrets than English phrasal verbs. Such a mishap. Jake sat in the living room, listening to music through headphones, or pretending to listen. Howard noticed how his fingers tapped the rhythm on the armchair's armrest precisely, in time with the bells ringing when Sophie and Min-ho passed by, as if his body had tuned into the frequency of the security system. The lovers settled at the table, supposedly immersed in the textbook as if it were a sacred text. But their hands under the table entwined more and more often, and their laughter became increasingly playful and provocative. They were so engrossed in each other that they didn't notice how Jake removed his headphones and turned his head in their direction, like a radar detecting suspicious activity. "I'll get some water," said Sophie, rising. Min-ho, as if tied to her by an invisible rope, followed her to the kitchen. "Time for a system check," Howard suddenly announced and began frantically waving his arms, impersonating a conductor before an orchestra that only he could see. "Maestro Toaster, begin the overture, F-sharp minor, opus, ringing trap." He accidentally brushed against one of the tripwires with such precision that professional sappers might have given a standing ovation, and a whole symphony of bells and chimes swept through the house. At that moment, muffled laughter and the sound of falling dishes came from the kitchen. The lovers had clearly been caught off guard, like teenagers by their parents. "Ah, how magnificent!" Howard exulted with the air of a conductor whose orchestra had just performed Beethoven's Ninth Symphony without a single mistake. "True music of the spheres. Too bad we don't have cymbals for the percussion section. Although wait, I think something just broke in the kitchen. Perhaps Comrade Cup decided to contribute to our musical experiment." Late in the evening, when the house had sunk into sleep like a ship into a quiet harbor, Howard slipped into the yard with a shovel at the ready. It was time to start the main part of his plan. Under the full moon's light, he began digging a pit, exactly like those that had saved his comrades' lives in the snowy hills of Korea. "Here's your English lesson," he muttered, wielding the shovel with the energy of a man half his age. "Now we'll learn a new word. Trap in Korean sounds completely different, but the result is always the same, like the headache after encountering it." Meanwhile in the house, Jake carefully removed his dark glasses and brought his hand to his eyes, as if doing something forbidden. In complete darkness, he could distinguish the faint glow of a streetlight penetrating through the curtains, like the first ray of hope. This was the first light he had seen in the past 7 months. But for now, he kept this discovery to himself. Something told him that Grandpa's paranoia wasn't as unfounded as the diagnosis in his medical card suggested. And Howard continued digging, humming, "Do you know the way to San Jose?" to himself, and periodically giving orders to an imaginary platoon. "Private Shovel, dig deeper. Sergeant Rake, camouflage the position. Corporal Toaster, report to base. Operation Lover's Pit is proceeding according to plan. And yes, I know you're still plugged into the kitchen outlet, but war requires sacrifices, even if only in the form of an extension cord." The neighbor's cat observed this scene from the fence, like a spectator in the front row of a theater, and Howard could swear that in its yellow eyes flashed if not approval, then interested curiosity. "What, Comrade Cat, switching to our side? Right decision. We have tuna here and a warm sock for sleeping. And what do these pigeons have? Just bread crumbs and communist propaganda in the form of droppings on capitalist figures' statues." Chapter 4, Suspicions. Min-ho no longer flinched when Howard began his usual morning radio broadcasts. Moreover, the Korean student had even begun to find a certain charm in them, like in an absurdist Ionesco play performed on a nursing home stage. "Attention, this is Radio Free Toaster," the old man broadcast into his banana microphone with the seriousness of a professional announcer. "Incident report for the past 24 hours. The agent cat has recruited 2 pigeons, 1 squirrel, and possibly the mailman. The enemy is building up manpower. Watch your hamsters, they could be recruited at any moment." "Good morning, Mr. Bennett," Minho greeted, walking into the kitchen with the grace of a man feeling at home. He no longer knocked on the door, he just entered, as if he had a lifetime subscription to visit. "Ah, our young friend," Howard squinted like an eagle spotting prey. "You're quite early today. The lesson is at 3, isn't it?" "Sophie asked me to come earlier." Minho smiled with the air of a man holding 4 aces. "She wanted to check my homework." "Yeah, right asterisk," thought Howard, especially the part that's done in a horizontal position to the accompaniment of labored breathing. Over the past weeks, the lovers had become surprisingly careless. They no longer hid in corners like cockroaches when the light comes on, but openly flirted right in front of blind Jake. Their lessons had turned into some perverted game. The closer they were to exposure, the more it excited them, like mountaineers' proximity to a precipice. "You know, in my youth I also had a fling with a Korean woman," Howard suddenly said, adjusting his invariable banana microphone like an expensive tie before an important interview. "In Seoul, though it later turned out she was working for North Korean intelligence. Tried to extract our secrets through the bedroom, can you imagine? Although, honestly, I'm not sure my knowledge of anatomy was of strategic interest." Minho choked on his coffee so that several drops described a trajectory in the air worthy of a ballistics textbook. Howard sympathetically patted him on the back with a force that made the student doubt the old man's frailty. "Careful, young man, coffee is a treacherous drink, especially when you drink it down the wrong pipe or in the wrong house." At that moment, Sophie entered the kitchen in a light house robe that accentuated rather than concealed her figure. Her hair was slightly tousled, and on her neck was a fresh love bite that she hadn't even bothered to conceal, the equivalent of wearing a medal for bravery on the field of amorous battles. "Oh, Minho, you're already here." She approached the refrigerator, accidentally brushing against him with her hip with such precision that it could have been used to calibrate scientific instruments. "Attention," Howard shouted again, as if he had seen a UFO. "Violation of personal space protocol. Comrade Toaster, record the time and coordinates." If this were animal mating behavior, the mating process would begin now, but since we're civilized people, we call it an accidental touch. "Grandpa, for God's sake," Sophie sighed with the intonation of someone who knows their prayers won't be heard. "We're just going to study." Of course," the old man nodded like a bobblehead during an earthquake. "Only in Incheon we were also just studying. And then bang, half the operational plans ended up with the North Koreans. Amazing coincidence, isn't it?" He shuffled to his armchair in the living room, mumbling something about tactile reconnaissance and bodily diversions. But his sharp hearing, which had retained the sensitivity of a sniper rifle, caught every rustle, every suppressed giggle coming from the kitchen. Jake came down half an hour later. His movements had become noticeably more confident. He no longer clung to the walls like a drowning man to a straw, but confidently navigated around all the tripwires with bells that Howard had hung, as if he had a complete map scheme of this acoustic minefield in his head. "Son," the old man exclaimed happily, "just in time. I'm preparing a report for the Joint Chiefs of Staff on suspicious activity in our house. Imagine, someone ate all the cookies I left for monitoring the enemy. This is clearly the work of enemy agents. No one else could be so insidious." "That was you, Grandpa," Jake smiled. "Last night, you said the cookies might have been recruited by Korean special services and posed a threat to national security." "Ah, right." Howard slapped his forehead with such force that the echo resounded throughout the room. "Had to resort to extreme measures, destroyed the evidence. I mean cookies with my own stomach. Operation Sweet Liquidation was successful, although there were some casualties among the milk and jam." At that moment, the sound of falling dishes and muffled laughter, resembling the cooing of pigeons in mating season, came from the kitchen. Howard noticed how Jake's fingers clenched on the armchair's armrest with such force that his knuckles turned white. "What's happening there?" asked the grandson in a tone that no longer even attempted to hide suspicion. "Oh, that's our lovebirds. I mean language students studying," Howard drawled with the intonation of someone describing the weather during a hurricane. "Very intensive learning program, especially in the area of, oral practice. I heard Korean is a very guttural language requiring special tongue skills. And English, isn't easy to absorb either, especially when you study it horizontally." He deliberately said this loud enough for the lovers in the kitchen to hear, but they seemed so engrossed in their educational program that they didn't even notice the artillery salvo of verbal irony. In the evening, when Minho finally left, after a particularly productive lesson, during which sounds emerged from Sophie's study more reminiscent of an adult film soundtrack than an educational process, Howard went to check his main trap. The pit was almost ready, perfect depth, perfect slope of the walls, perfect camouflage of branches and leaves, as if Mother Nature herself had decided to participate in his operation. "What do you think, Kitty?" he addressed the cat, which was observing his work from the fence like a general on a hill watching the course of a battle. "Perhaps we should conduct a demonstration exercise. You pretend to be an enemy scout, and I'll demonstrate the effectiveness of our defense system. I can guarantee a soft landing and a can of tuna as a combat bonus." The cat contemptuously snorted and turned away with the air of an aristocrat who had been offered to dine at a fast food restaurant. "Oh, so that's how it is," Howard smirked. All right, I understand. You're an independent agent, working for your own feline intelligence. They probably pay more in tuna." Later that evening, he overheard Sophie's phone conversation. She didn't even try to speak quietly, so accustomed to the safety provided by her husband's blindness and her father-in-law's supposed insanity. It was like shouting confessions in a square, confident that everyone around is deaf. "Yes, darling, tomorrow as usual. This excites me more and more. When he sits nearby wearing headphones and yes, I know it's terrible, but isn't that the whole point? The danger of being caught. It's like a drug." Howard shook his head. He had seen this in Korea, how overconfidence leads to defeat. The enemy becomes careless, loses vigilance, starts making mistakes. It's like slow suicide, only the victim thinks they're just having fun. He laid out his map of the house on the bed, where red crosses marked all the points of no return, places where the lovers allowed themselves special liberties, like a geography of betrayal. The red crosses were becoming more numerous, turning the map into a field for a game of tic-tac-toe where betrayal always wins. "Well," he muttered, looking out the window at his camouflaged pit, black in the moonlight like a portal to another dimension. "As my old sergeant used to say, the deeper the pit, the louder the echo of the fall. And you and I, dear pit, still have a couple of days to become even deeper and more hospitable." Chapter 5: The Trap. The storm was approaching the city like a North Korean regiment advancing on American positions, inexorably, and with a promise of grand changes to the landscape. Howard stood by the window, watching as heavy clouds shrouded the sky in their morning attire. The old bucket at his feet emitted a faint smell of what could delicately be called organic waste. "Comrade Toaster," he whispered to his chrome partner, "today we'll conduct Operation Wet Business. And no, that's not a pun. Although," he looked at the bucket and smirked like a man who had just thought of a joke but decided the world wasn't ready for it. For the past week, Howard had demonstratively refused to use the toilet, claiming that, in Korea, "I got used to going in a bucket in the bunker, because upstairs North Korean snipers were just waiting for you to stand up to relieve yourself." Sophie was so furious she could have replaced a medium-sized power plant, but she resigned herself, another quirk of the senile old man. Who knew it was part of a plan, complex as a Swiss watch, but reliable as a Russian rifle? Jake sat in the living room without headphones, as if for the first time in a long while he had decided not to barricade himself behind a sound barrier. His dark glasses lay on the table. He was no longer trying to hide that he could distinguish light and shadows, like a primitive man seeing the first dawn. Through the huge windows, he could see the first lightning flashes, silver cracks in the darkening sky. "Grandpa," he called quietly, "you were right all this time." Howard stopped pretending to be a mad veteran. His voice became hard as Japanese sword steel. "How long have you known?" "Saw them kissing in the kitchen a week ago. They thought I was asleep." Jake clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white as first snow. "And before that, I just didn't want to believe it, chalked everything up to paranoia. Mine, yours." "In Incheon," Howard spoke slowly, as if each word was a bullet that needed to be properly loaded, "we learned one simple truth. Paranoia is not a disease. It's a survival mechanism. Like cold isn't a disease but a signal to put on a sweater." The first raindrops drummed on the roof like drummers announcing the beginning of battle. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Sophie was preparing for her lover's arrival. She didn't even try to be quiet, so accustomed to her husband's blindness and father-in-law's insanity, as if these two conditions were a wall separating her from consequences. "Today?" asked Jake. Howard nodded, gripping the bucket tighter. "Today, are you ready?" "Ready." The old man slowly descended to the basement. The electrical panel flickered in the half-light with green indicators, like ghost eyes in the darkness. For a moment, Howard allowed himself one last joke. "Farewell, Comrade Toaster. You were a good soldier," he whispered, looking at the faithful partner he had brought with him for the final act of the play. "The time has come for your last mission. Operation Short Goodbye begins." He placed the toaster on the floor near the electrical panel, plugged it in, and saluted with the solemnity of an honor guard. "Serving with you has been an honor for me. You are a brave soldier and a loyal friend. Your sacrifice will not be forgotten. Your name will be inscribed in toaster history in golden letters, pre-toasted to a crispy crust." And then with one motion, he overturned the bucket right onto the working toaster. There was a loud hiss, as if an enraged snake had broken free. Sparks flew like a miniature firework and... "Comrade Toaster, you are a true hero," Howard managed to whisper, before the house plunged into darkness as if someone had turned off the sun. The short circuit plunged the house into darkness. In the bedroom upstairs, Min-ho abruptly pulled away from Sophie, with whom they had been indulging in passion, not even bothering to close the door. Who did they have to fear? The blind husband downstairs, the senile old man somewhere in the basement. "Don't worry," Sophie whispered, running her hand over his chest. "Just the fuses, I'll go check." "Sorry," Howard's voice came from below. A small diversion in the style of North Korean PARTISANS, technical DIFFICULTIES. "I advise everyone to stay put and sing patriotic songs." This was the last time they heard the old man's joking tone, as if he had removed the jester's mask and revealed the warrior's face. "I'll look myself." Min-ho began dressing with the haste of a man who had suddenly realized he was not where he should be. "I'll bring candles from the kitchen too." In the pitch darkness, he slowly descended the stairs, holding onto the railing like a child to a mother's hand. The thunder outside rumbled closer, as if a huge beast was approaching the house, and in the next lightning flash, he saw something that made his blood freeze in his veins. Jake stood at the foot of the stairs, without his dark glasses, and his eyes were looking directly at Min-ho, like the scope of a sniper rifle. "You know," the Special Forces soldier's voice was calm, frighteningly calm, like the calm before a storm. "When you lose one sense, the others become heightened. I heard every breath you took, every suppressed moan, every creak of the bed above my head, like music except I didn't like the melody." Min-ho backed up the stairs like a crab trying to avoid the tide. "Jake, I can explain." "Explain." In Jake's laugh there wasn't a drop of joy, only the cold of Antarctic ice. "Explain what exactly? How you slept with my wife while I sat wearing headphones? How you laughed at the blind cripple? Or maybe..." He took a step forward like a predator preparing to pounce. You'll explain why you decided you'd leave here on your own 2 feet. A new flash of lightning illuminated the former Special Forces soldier's face, and Min-ho saw in it what North Korean soldiers saw before leaving this world. He turned and ran like an antelope from a lion. The first tripwire caught him on the second floor. Bells rang like a funeral toll in the cemetery of hopes. He got tangled in the fishing line, crashed to the floor, but immediately jumped up as if stung by an invisible bee and darted toward the back stairs. "Run," Jake's voice echoed in the darkness like the voice of conscience. "Run like your ancestors ran from my grandfather on the hills of Incheon." Min-ho flew into the kitchen, knocking over a chair that fell with the crash of a brass band. He was shaking with fear and the sudden realization. All this month they had been laughing at the crazy old man, who had actually been methodically preparing a trap for him, like a spider weaving a web for a particularly overconfident fly. "Jake, I beg you," Sophie's cry came from upstairs, resembling a seagull's wail in a storm. "Don't." "Shut up," her husband barked with such fury that she choked on her next words, as if swallowing them along with the air. Min-ho reached the back door, but the handle wouldn't budge, as if the door had decided it was in alliance with the homeowner. Locked. He darted to the window, getting tangled in the ropes Howard had hung, stumbling over some cans placed with the cunning worthy of a military strategist. Each ring, each crash revealed his position, as if he himself wore a bell like a cow in an alpine meadow. "How do you like the darkness?" Jake's voice sounded closer, pursuing him like a shadow. "Unfamiliar, right? When you don't know what's a step away from you, when every sound could mean the end, when you're helpless like a newborn kitten." Finally, Min-ho managed to open the window. He tumbled outside into the pouring rain like an awkward acrobat who had failed a trick. Lightning illuminated the backyard, and he saw Howard standing on the porch with a cane in his hands and the air of a commander observing the course of a battle. The old man saluted him, a gesture in which there was nothing comical, only the solemnity of farewell. "Good Lord!" Min-ho yelled when the ground suddenly disappeared beneath his feet, as if it had decided it no longer wanted anything to do with him. He fell into a perfectly camouflaged pit, the kind scouts made in the hills of Korea, and sharp pain pierced his leg like an electric shock. In the next lightning flash, he saw Jake leaning over the pit. Raindrops streamed down his face like tears he could not or would not shed. "You know what's the worst part?" The Special Forces soldier spoke in that same frighteningly calm tone, as if discussing the weather forecast. "Not that you slept with my wife, but that you turned it into a game, into a dirty entertainment. Each time you did it in my house thinking I couldn't see anything. It excited you even more, right? Like children playing with fire." Min-ho whimpered in pain, cradling his broken leg like a child with a favorite toy. Somewhere upstairs, Sophie was sobbing, her crying mingling with the rain into some eerie symphony of the end. "Now listen to me carefully," Jake squatted at the edge of the pit like a judge ready to pass sentence. "You will leave the country, forever, if I find out you've stayed, if I ever see you near this house." He smirked, and in that smirk was something that made Min-ho shudder more than from the pain in his leg. "You know, Grandpa taught me a couple of techniques from Korea. Turns out his stories weren't so crazy after all. Some of them aren't even crazy enough compared to reality." The storm raged over the house, as if nature itself had decided to become the backdrop for this drama. And in the basement, in a puddle of not-so-clean water, lay a charred toaster, the only innocent victim of this night, a faithful soldier fallen in the unequal battle with electricity and human passions. Chapter 6: Old Tricks. The police arrived 15 minutes after the neighbor's call, who had heard screams. The soaked patrol officers, resembling otters after a bath, encountered a strange scene. A Korean student with a broken leg in a pit in the backyard, a sobbing woman on the porch, a blind Special Forces veteran, and his elderly father who was for some reason trying to salute a burnt kitchen appliance. Just an accident, Howard explained to the surprised police officers, suddenly ceasing to impersonate a senile old man. The young man got lost in the dark, and the pit, old military habit. In Korea, these always saved lives, although usually we dug them for enemies, not guests. But in the dark, all cats are gray and all pits are just pits. The detective who arrived at the scene turned out to be an Iraq veteran. One look at the impeccably executed trap, and he understood everything, as people who have seen war understand each other. In his report appeared the line "accident during adverse weather conditions and poor lighting," and in his personal diary, a note that old soldiers don't rust, they just wait for their moment. A week later, Min-ho was deported. Something in his student visa suddenly turned out to be not quite in compliance with current legislation. Perhaps this was somehow connected to the long conversation that took place between Howard and his old army buddy, who now served in the immigration service. A conversation in which the words national security and moral character were heard more often than hello at a doctor's reception. Sophie left the next day after the incident. She left a short note. "I'm sorry. I don't deserve even these words, but I'm sorry." The divorce went quickly and quietly, like a special forces operation, without a single shot fired or an extra word spoken. She waived all claims to property and disappeared somewhere on the West Coast, as if washed away by the very rain that fell on the night of the exposure. A month later, Jake and Howard sat on the porch, watching the sunset painting the sky in colors that Jake was beginning to distinguish better. His vision was improving every day. Now he could see not only light and shadows, but also colors, the outlines of objects, as if the world was slowly returning to him from a long exile. Son," Howard twirled his invariable banana in his hands, now without pretense using it as a microphone, more out of habit than for disguise. "I need to confess something to you." "That you were never crazy," Jake smiled. "I figured that out the night you caused the short circuit. You calculated everything too precisely, like in a military strategy textbook." The old man chuckled like a satisfied cat. "In Incheon, they taught us, the best camouflage is what the enemy believes. They thought I had lost my mind and they lost their vigilance, like the North Koreans when we pretended to retreat." "And the toaster," Jake nodded toward the new appliance, peacefully standing on the kitchen windowsill, gleaming in the rays of the setting sun. "Was that also part of the disguise?" "Don't talk nonsense," Howard snorted with genuine indignation. "Private Toaster was a true hero, fell in the line of duty at his post. This recruit isn't fit to hold a candle to him, can't even toast bread evenly. I tell him, measure up to a hero, but he stands there, a chrome slacker, pretending not to understand human speech." They were silent, watching the sun set like a tired soldier taking a break. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and this sound no longer made Howard jump up with a cry of enemy bloodhounds. "You know what's most amusing?" the old man suddenly said, stroking the banana as if it were a beloved cat. "All these tripwires, bells, cans. I really did use such things in Korea, only then it wasn't an act, it was life and death." Jake nodded. "Will you tell me about it?" And Howard began to tell. Without pretense, without feigned insanity, just stories of an old soldier who had seen too much for one human life. About snowy hills where nights were so cold, it seemed even the stars could freeze. About how he learned to determine by the sound of footsteps who was coming, friend or foe. About comrades who didn't return, and about those who did return but were never the same again. 6 months later, they turned that very pit into a pond. Jake joked that it was Howard's idea to rehabilitate the crime scene to divert suspicion. In reality, the old man had always wanted to raise carp. This dream had appeared when his unit was stationed near a monastery with a pond full of orange fish in Korea. "You'll see," he said, releasing the first fish into the pond. "They'll be our new sentries. A carp is also a soldier, just an underwater one. and much more disciplined than you were at 20 when you decided that the Army Reveille was just a friendly recommendation. By that time, Jake was already working at a rehabilitation center for veterans. His story about how he lost his sight and then regained it gave hope to others like a lighthouse in a stormy sea. But he never told the complete version. About the betrayal, the revenge, the pit in the backyard. Some stories are better left untold, like a good book with an open ending. Every evening he and his grandfather sat by the pond, fed the carp and talked. About war and peace, about loyalty and betrayal, about darkness and light. Sometimes they were joined by the cat, the very cat that Howard had once accused of espionage. Now the old man called him Major of Feline Intelligence, retired, and the cat seemed to respond to this title better than to his name, Fluffy. "You know what I realized," Howard said one day, watching the setting sun coloring the sky in hues similar to those he had seen over Incheon many years ago. "Old tricks work, always, but the main thing isn't the tricks themselves, but what you use them for, and who you're fighting for." Jake looked at his grandfather. Now he could see every wrinkle on his face, every scar left by time and war, like a map of a long and difficult life. "Thank you, Grandpa," he said quietly. "For what?" "For teaching me to see in the dark." Howard smiled and pulled a banana from his pocket. "This is Radio Free Pond speaking. We're broadcasting the latest news. All carp are at their battle stations, the perimeter is under control, and Comrade Cat has finally been promoted to Colonel of Feline Intelligence. His merits in Operation Toast and Justice have been recognized with the Order of the Golden Can. And yes, this isn't just a banana, it's a symbol of our victory." And they laughed no longer with bitterness, without pretense, just as a grandfather and grandson who had fought their war and found their peace. And somewhere in the depths of the pond swam a huge orange carp, resembling a submarine, lurking in wait for the next adventure.